I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we examine the horrors that exist on our streets. Now, that phrase was used by Leonard Krog, the mayor of Nanaimo, to describe what he sees every single day in his city. Others use the euphemism, the disorder in our streets. But whatever you call it, it certainly denigrates the livability of so many communities around BC. And it started way before decriminalization. All across North America, not just BC, there was a movement in the 70s away from institutionalized care for the mentally ill, in part as a result of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That was a terrifying tale of abuse that no one would support. However, rather than ask how can we improve the way we care for the severely mentally ill, it was broadly decided that almost no one should be in secured care. Thus, Riverview was closed, a huge mistake in my opinion. I realize that the percent of those who are severely mentally ill and in need of help is small, but to think that those individuals would be able to cope on their own, find housing, remember to take their meds, eat properly, and be safe is absurd. Instead, so many have become the victims of drug dealers and pimps. So now this vulnerable population has to deal with a decriminalization experiment that has increased the public use and abuse of drugs. The drugs are stronger, overdoses are frequent, brain damage too often the consequence. And still, there are those who hear of the violent stranger attacks or see individuals lying on the streets in desperate state, but continue to argue against secured care. Mayor Leonard Krog isn't one of them. He has been outspoken about the need for a new approach. He joins me after this break. You know, Leonard Krog has been involved in politics since the early 90s. And in fact, at one point, you and I sat opposite each other in the provincial legislature. And then in 2018, you decided to run for mayor and of course won. And Nanaimo was very lucky to have you. Thank you for your public service.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today.
So in the time that you've been involved, and especially with Nanaimo and watching the changes, how is your city these days?
You know what? The city is doing very well overall. You know, we're one of the 5 fastest growing regions in the country. We're clocking in at 2% a year. There's lots of housing been built. Very desirable place to move to. We're a much more diverse, multicultural community than we were even historically. But like all communities across this province and across this country, and indeed North America, the street disorder, the mental health, addictions, trauma, and brain injury crisis manifesting itself in homelessness and the petty crime associated with feeding a drug habit is just as apparent in our streets as it is everywhere. And that's the troublesome part over which municipal governments have no control, no jurisdiction particularly. And when I say no control, we have to handle policing, etc., but we're not delivering those crucial services that are going to get us out of what is a crisis.
And so what are those crucial services that should be in place?
I have said repeatedly, both to the Premier when he was Minister responsible for housing and to him personally as part of the BC Urban Mayors Caucus, on behalf of my own council and any politician who listen, the basic is you acknowledge the seriousness of the problem, and it is enormously important to everyone in British Columbia. You need to announce the bricks and mortar because we don't have the facilities available. You need to announce the money for the universities and colleges to provide the kind of training. Dealing with people who have mental health, addiction, trauma, brain injury issues, often in combination, all of them or some combination, are challenging to deal with. And then you need to remind people that this is 30, 40 years of failed social and health policy. We're not going to get it fixed overnight, but British Columbians need some hope. The people in the streets need hope. Their families need hope. The businesses and the employees in every downtown in this province need some hope. Those are the basics as I see it. I've also advocated, not always to popular applause I might add, for secure and voluntary care for a portion of the folks in the street. people say, oh, look, we've had more people held under the Mental Health Act than at any time in British Columbia's history. And I've responded, yes, but that's some nice person who has a home to go back to, who perhaps is the spouse or the daughter or the son, whatever. They're going to spend 8 weeks or 10 weeks or whatever in a psych ward somewhere. They're going to get assistance and help that they need. They'll maybe off in a treatment center. I'm talking about the people who are already homeless and have been homeless often for a very, very long time. Their families have done their best to try and help them. They can't help them. That's the portion of people that I'm focusing on.
You also have used the word brain damage, and it interests me because not many people talk about that part of the mental health issues.
I have been, accused, criticized for bringing it up in the sense that some see it as me trying to stigmatize people with brain injury. What the, I think it's Canadian Brain Injury Society study showed is that over half the people who arrive on the streets already have some form of brain injury. And it tends to get worse, not better, out there in the streets. If someone has overdosed, been a victim of the poisonous drug supply, they're brought back with naloxone, whatever the case may be, chances are they've suffered further brain damage. And so I'm coming at it from a compassionate point of view, not in the sense of it being critical or saying everyone who has a brain injury is going to be in the streets and is committing criminal acts and is a drug addict and all of the things that many will try and say is the reality of the streets. It's much more complex than that. I just want people to understand that it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of work. And right now, people are ending up in the streets who may already have a brain injury and an addiction and a mental health issue because we don't have the things that I started talking about a few minutes ago, which are the facilities and the care and the treatment, the supportive housing, whatever's necessary to try and prevent them from sliding further down into the horror, which are the streets of this province in many places.
I don't think many people realize that something like Narcan, so you overdose, and everybody now knows they get shots of Narcan, sometimes a couple of shots, but that does some damage. And so it's not an easy solution to saying, oh, well, we'll just make sure everybody's got Narcan because, you know, brain does get damaged.
Well, exactly. We are in a situation now where we are expending a great deal of money, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector. The Save Our Streets forum in Vancouver a few weeks ago, the bringing together of businesses, chambers of commerce, mental health advocates, etc., that's all come about because the amount of money being spent on private security, insurance losses, theft, all of the things that relate to that, all of the calls in the public sector to police, to ambulance, to paramedics, street workers, etc., who are dealing with this. There's a great deal of money being spent, and I'm not saying you can shift it all. As you well know from your experience in government, you don't get to just shift a pot of money and solve the problem. It's not that simple. But we're spending a great deal and nothing's getting better. What good does it do to take somebody off the streets, drive them up to the Nanaimo Regional General Hospital in my city, have them there for a few hours till they're calmed down or they've been given some meds, and then put them back out on the street? It doesn't make anything any better. And I can't begin to tell you how many parents, family members have written, emailed me, phoned me, talked to me about the incredible tragedy and stressor these kinds of situations are for them and their loved ones. As I always say, nobody's happy. The people in the streets aren't happy. Their families aren't happy. The government's not happy. The citizens aren't happy. So for heaven's sakes, if we're all so unhappy, let's treat this with the seriousness that it requires.
I think many politicians just don't want to use the word secured involuntary care. And of course, immediately if you do say it, then everyone jumps on you. But there are people that just will not be able to cope.
Absolutely. When you and I were in the legislature together, I hated the term messaging. You had to stick to the damn message. There's nothing more frustrating for anyone with an ounce of intelligence than being told you have to stick to the message, stick to the message. I've been sticking to the message now myself for 5 years. I won't be saying anything today that I haven't said over and over again. No one is asking for a return to one flew over the cuckoo's nest. No one is asking for the return of Nurse Ratched. But smaller community-based facilities where people would have access to family and supports, their own friends, acquaintances, whatever the case may be, but secure, are what is needed. To pretend somehow that we don't have at least the same percentage of people with serious mental health, addiction, trauma, brain injury issues today as we did 50 years ago is silly. And indeed, it's worse now, and we know it's worse because of the opioid crisis. Nice middle-class people were told, you know, just take this new painkiller. This will get you through, and things will be fine. And then after a while, the doc says, "I'm sorry, but we can't keep you on this any longer." And suddenly, you have some middle-class person who formerly had employment and a family who's out buying street drugs, and it's a downhill spiral from there. This isn't anything that people don't know, but as you say, politicians, I think, are reluctant to use the term secure and voluntary care. Others are trying to find better words. I talked about institutional care when I first started talking about this over 5 years ago. Got hell for it in the Globe and Mail. It's nice that the Globe and Mail recognizes a small town mayor in BC.
We have to take a break, but we'll continue this discussion about institutionalized maybe or involuntary care. Back in a moment. Mayor Krog is with us today, and we're talking about some of the issues he deals with every time council is called. You know, you said drugs, as they're more serious these days, but at that same SOS conference, there was a Dr. Matthew who went into detail saying it's not just that they're stronger, but they are different composites. And what he's seeing as a doctor, a psychiatrist, is that this causes psychosis in many people. So when we think we're seeing more violence on the street, we're not imagining it. We are seeing it, and because the drugs are directly causing more psychosis, which scares everybody, of course.
Look, it's a frightening proposition for people who feel or are vulnerable, who don't suffer from addiction or mental health or trauma issues, to go anywhere as near folks who may be or are exhibiting those behaviors. All it takes is one senior citizen who won't come to City Hall anymore, who came down and got yelled at by someone in a psychotic mood, who phoned me afterwards and said, "I'm never coming downtown again." She was frightened. And I can't blame her. And what I can say to her is, your chances of being injured or harmed are slim. The behavior is frightening, I get it. But telling her that is not going to relieve her from the fear she genuinely now has. And as you see more and more of it, the more outlandish acts of violence in my own community, Mr. Kutzner, who had received an award from the Governor General of Canada for community service, was murdered by a young fellow who had been attempting to get assistance to deal with his severe mental health issues, and stabbed Mr. Kutzner to death in the back of the Buzz coffee shop in Nanaimo. We know the incidents that happened last year in Vancouver, that the young Japanese chef killed under the Georgia Street Viaduct, the poor fellow who was murdered, the other who had his hand severed. These are extreme cases, and I don't bring them up to frighten people, but to point out that in the really extreme cases, the violence that results is the worst. It's death. Let alone those who are attacked and injured, and again, those who are too frightened to take employment in certain parts of the community, the businesses that go under, the lives that suffer, the damage to the economy, the damage to our reputation. We heard that at the SOS conference. International tourists being told to avoid certain parts of communities. Is this the best we can do in a 21st century modern liberal democracy? The envy of the world, according to Sachi Curl at Ipsos Reid, in terms of the place people wish to immigrate to if they're not happy in their own country? I think we can do better. So, to do better, you've talked about some of the solutions, and that is having smaller facilities spread around the province that give someone who is severely mentally ill
all kinds of different support. I'm not so optimistic our politicians are going to do that. Because I remember I got quite excited when Premier Horgan first mentioned it, and then the Greens refused to go along with it. So then he called an election, he got a majority, but the word was never mentioned again, secured care. When Mr. Eby ran for the leadership, he mentioned it, and then nothing much has happened. So it seems so urgent, so obvious to me that something has to be done, but now again, the NDP are dependent on the Greens, and the Greens have said absolutely no secured care. So do you have any hope that it's going to get done?
I do have hope because the BC Conservatives will support moves in that direction. I think the Premier, the gossip is that he suffered a near-death experience in the last election, and candidly, and I say this as someone who sat as an NDP caucus member, essentially the NDP lost the last election. I mean, that's really what happened. And I think there were several things at work, but one of the greatest motivators was this issue of the street disorder, the fear. It's not even the crime aspect of it, and although that's disappointing enough and upsetting enough to the public. It's the sense that people are populating our streets who should be living a better life just as those around them. I've used the phrase over and over again. People are living in hell in the streets and they're making it hell for others. I think the government has no choice. And by that, I mean on a political level, it has no choice. It has to move in this direction, and it has to be seen to be moving as well as actually doing it. And if it doesn't, the BC Conservatives will sort themselves out. They will become more organized and effective as an opposition, and the current government will face defeat. I'm satisfied that this is a vote-determining issue for many people. I mean, right now at the federal level, it's not going to be the carbon tax. Mr. Poilievre picked the wrong horse there. No one anticipated that Mr. Trump would be as over the top as he is. But in a provincial sense, this continues day after day in British Columbia. So I am sincerely hopeful and relatively confident the government will take the necessary steps. I'm not hearing the same kinds of things that I've heard from them in the last few years as I am today. So let's be hopeful, because you know what? Most of us are motivated with a sense of compassion and decency and concern for our fellow citizens. We can't let this continue.
A sister problem to this, not as dangerous for people on the street maybe, but really serious in terms of communities' livability, is the retail crime. And it seems like it's an open day. Go in, shoplift, grab a Mixmaster or something, out the door, off you go.
It's incredibly frustrating, and it destroys confidence in the justice system generally. It makes police feel inadequate to their work because they know that somebody who has a severe drug issue, and again, and I want to emphasize this, it's not generally just a severe drug issue. It's complicated by a mental health issue. It's complicated by a brain injury, some form of trauma in their past. When ordinary citizens see this, let alone the police, it breaks down the social order. How do you say to, your children, now don't steal, be kind, be good, while they can go down to the local London Drugs or a store and see someone walk in, yell, scream, grab stuff, and wander out. And the business involved often just says, why bother call the police? This is the same repeat offender that I've seen. And there are enough stories like this, there's enough anecdotal evidence that people believe this to be the way it is. Whether it's true or not even doesn't matter anymore. The public perception is that there is a lawlessness and a disorder that didn't exist before, and people want it fixed.
So even given all the issues a person might have in their background, when they come before a judge and they've got 60 times they've been in and out, and they get released right away again. That's what people don't understand. The
bail reform issue is important. I think the Supreme Court of Canada needs to look at this again. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms basically is the impetus and says, look, you do not take away someone's liberty unless they've been convicted of a crime. So unless there's a real risk of violence to the public, and I'm not a criminal lawyer by profession, you're going to have them released pending trial on most criminal cases. But where you have, as the example you use, someone who for 50th, 60th time, they've shoplifted or stolen, grabbed a purse, whatever the case may be, and they're out again, not cutting it with the general public. And how you fix that is up to the federal government in terms of bail reform and attorneys general in this country who are prepared to implement some policy changes. But you can't allow that to continue. But the issue of the person who's doing it for the 50th or 60th time, their issue is probably not really criminal in a sense. It's a health issue. And right now we have a bunch of people in the middle who are not dealt with under the criminal justice system or dealt with under the healthcare system. They're ignored by both in some sense, or neither wishes to really touch them because one believes it's a criminal problem, the other believes it's a health problem, and or some horrible combination thereof. And so you have this, I hate to say it, it's a license to steal in a sense. And again, destroys confidence in our government and in our institutions. And surely what we're seeing in the United States reminds us that when people don't have faith in the institutions of government, that's when you're headed for real trouble. I don't want to go over the top, but that's when you're headed for real trouble.
Thank you, Leonard, for joining us today. Good luck with council and all of these issues. And I always enjoyed listening to you in the legislature. Thank you. We'll be back in a moment. I'm an avid supporter of public policy. At its best, it is a thoughtful approach to solving problems, but it only comes to life when it's tied to action. Our government is tiptoeing into the idea of secured involuntary care for those who are severely mentally ill, at a time that we really need some focused action. Please let me know your thoughts on YouTube. I appreciate hearing from you. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.